The galaxy had always known peace, a fragile peace held together by a mutual understanding of boundaries. But this was shattered the day the Thraxians, the most feared species in the galaxy, issued their ultimatum. They didn't just want dominance, they demanded submission. And if submission wasn't given, war would be the answer. The Thraxians were warriors bred for combat, towering in size, muscles layered over thick, armored skin. Their civilization had been built on conquest after conquest, and now, they had set their eyes on Earth and humanity. It wasn't the first time humanity had faced an overwhelming force, but in the grand scheme of the galaxy, humans were seen as young, naive, and untested. The other species in the Galactic Council had their doubts. Humans were newcomers, peaceful, curious, and by all accounts soft. But the Thraxians didn't care about diplomacy, and this time, they weren't interested in negotiation. To them, war was the only language they respected. General Marcus stood in the Grand Hall of the Council, flanked by representatives of other species who silently waited for his response. His expression remained calm, his posture unshaken, despite the looming threat across the room. The leader of the Thraxians, a being named Varkal, stared him down, towering over every other species in the chamber. Varkal's deep, resonating voice echoed through the hall as he repeated his demand. "We do not ask twice, human. You will submit, or we will grind your species to dust. The choice is yours." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one in the chamber expected humanity to fight back, not against a species that had decimated every rival it had ever faced. Even the other council members, who were allies of Earth, seemed resigned to the idea of humanity's defeat, should it come to war. But General Marcus didn't falter. He stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. "We've faced war before, Varkal. More than you can imagine. But we don't have to fight to show our strength." Varkal scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "You speak in riddles. We seek war, not words." "Words can teach, Varkal," Marcus said, his gaze unwavering. "And before you decide to go to war with us, I'd like to offer you a lesson in history. Our history." The room stirred. The Thraxians laughed, a deep rumble of amusement echoing from Varkal's massive form. He took a step forward, the ground seeming to shake beneath his feet. "A history lesson? You insult us with your weakness." But Marcus remained calm. "You misunderstand. You think strength comes from muscle and power alone. But strength comes in many forms, Varkal. If you're so certain of your superiority, then humor us. Listen to our history. And after, if you still wish to fight, we'll give you the war you want." Varkal paused. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was arrogance, but he nodded. "Speak then. Entertain us." Marcus took a deep breath. He wasn't there to intimidate or boast, that wasn't humanity's way. Instead, he would show them a truth the Thraxians had never considered, a truth buried deep within humanity's story. "Our history is one of survival," Marcus began. "We've faced extinction time and time again, long before we reached the stars. We fought wars that nearly wiped us out, not because we were strong, but because we were underestimated." The Thraxians listened, their expressions ranging from amusement to disinterest. But Marcus continued undeterred. "Thousands of years ago, the Roman Empire ruled most of our planet. They were the most powerful force humanity had ever seen, unstoppable in their prime. But they fell. Not because they were defeated in battle, but because they underestimated those they called barbarians. Small, disorganized tribes, weaker by every measure, brought down an empire that seemed invincible." A flicker of interest sparked in Varkal's eyes, though he tried to hide it. Marcus pressed on. "Then came the Great Wars. World War II, a conflict so vast it engulfed the entire planet. Millions died. But what saved humanity wasn't sheer force, it was our ability to adapt, to innovate. We developed technology that changed the very nature of warfare. We created weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single strike, not because we wanted to, but because we had no choice." Varkal's amusement began to fade. The Thraxians thrived on conquest, but Marcus was painting a picture of war that wasn't about glory. It was about survival. We didn't fight because we wanted to conquer. We fought because we had to. We fought for our existence, and every time, we came back stronger. Our strength isn't in our weapons or our numbers. It's in our resilience, our ability to rise from the ashes when everything seems lost. The chamber was silent now. Even the other species were listening intently, their skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity. Marcus's voice softened, but his words carried weight. You think a war with us would be a battle of strength. But we've fought wars that lasted years, decades. Wars where we had no hope of winning but fought anyway because that's what we do. We survive. Varkel's expression was unreadable now, but Marcus could see the shift in his stance. The Thoraxians were warriors, yes, but they had never faced an opponent who fought not for conquest, but for survival at any cost. You seek war because it's all you know, Marcus said. But war with humanity will not end the way you think. We don't fight for power. We fight to protect what's ours. And when we fight, we don't stop. For the first time, Varkel hesitated. Marcus seized the moment. I'm not here to threaten you, Varkel. I'm here to show you that fighting us would be a mistake. You would win battles, yes. But we would never stop fighting. And in the end, you would lose, not because we are stronger, but because we endure. The silence that followed was profound. Varkel stared at Marcus, his eyes narrowing as he considered the words. The Thoraxians had never faced an enemy like this, one that didn't fear their strength, but instead used their own resilience as a weapon. Finally, Varkel spoke, his voice lower, more thoughtful. You believe your history makes you invincible? Marcus shook his head. Not invincible. Just prepared. For a long moment, the two leaders stood in silence, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. General Marcus had their attention now. The Thoraxians might have been skeptical, but there was a shift in the room. What they couldn't yet grasp was how humanity had always thrived in situations where strength alone wasn't enough. Marcus knew that physical dominance, which the Thoraxians so greatly valued, was only a small part of war. The true battles were won in the mind and in the heart, where persistence and strategy outshone brute force. We've had our fair share of conflicts, Marcus began, his tone steady. But those wars weren't just about destruction or territory. They were about survival. They were about standing against overwhelming odds and coming out on the other side, not through strength alone, but through resilience, intelligence, and adaptation. He looked Varkel directly in the eyes. One of the most brutal wars in our history was the Second World War. Two great powers, both believing they could shape the world through force, brought humanity to the brink of ruin. Entire cities were turned to ash, and millions died. But it wasn't sheer numbers or strength that turned the tide. It was something far more dangerous to any enemy, our ingenuity. The Thoraxians still appeared unimpressed. What could a race as fragile as humanity possibly understand about real warfare, about total domination? But Marcus was unfazed. During that war, we developed technology that redefined warfare itself. We cracked codes that were deemed unbreakable. Our scientists unlocked the secrets of the atom, creating weapons so devastating they forced entire nations to reconsider the very notion of conflict. We built machines that flew faster than sound, weapons that could strike before the enemy even knew they were being attacked. There was a slight shift in the Thoraxians now, a glint of curiosity in Varkel's eyes. He was beginning to realize that perhaps there was more to this species than he had initially thought. And yet, even in the face of all that power, it wasn't our weapons that saved us, Marcus continued. It was our ability to learn, to adapt, to turn the tide of battle with our minds, not just our muscles. We didn't rely solely on strength. We used strategy, deception, and patience. We created alliances, we studied our enemies, and we outlasted them. A murmur rippled through the gathered representatives. The Thoraxians had never valued patience in war. To them, victory came swiftly, and those who survived the initial onslaught were simply fodder for the next. But Marcus was describing something different, something that couldn't be defeated by overwhelming force alone. We've seen what happens when a powerful force thinks it can win through strength alone, Marcus said, his voice firm. But brute force isn't enough. Not when you're up against an opponent who refuses to stop fighting. An opponent who will use every resource, every bit of knowledge, and every ounce of will to survive. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, allowing their weight to settle on the room. Then, he leaned in, his tone measured but intense. In that war, we learned that there are no quick victories. Even the most powerful armies can be brought down by those who refuse to surrender. We learned that sometimes, the greatest strength is endurance. And endurance is something humanity has in abundance. The Thraxians remained silent, but Marcus could see the tension in Varkel's posture. The leader of the Thraxians was not used to hearing such words. He was accustomed to opponents who either bowed before him or tried, in vain, to match his people's might. But here was Marcus, calmly explaining that humanity was not like other species. We have faced extinction before, Marcus said, but we've never given up. Our history is filled with moments where we were pushed to the edge of survival, and yet, we always found a way to come back stronger. We don't break, Varkel. We bend, we adapt, and we learn. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the assembled species. You see, while you may have the strongest soldiers, the most advanced weapons, and the most dominant presence in the galaxy, you underestimate the most dangerous thing about humanity. We don't just survive conflict. We grow stronger because of it. The Thraxians were listening now, truly listening. They had never been taught to fear endurance or intelligence. To them, victory was about force, about overwhelming strength. But Marcus was showing them something they hadn't considered, a species that didn't need to be the strongest to win. A species that learned from every encounter, every mistake, and every setback. During that same war, Marcus continued, our enemies believed they could bring us to our knees through sheer force. They believed that by attacking our cities, breaking our will, they could force us to surrender. But instead, it only made us more determined. We rebuilt faster than they could destroy. We innovated while they stagnated. And when the time came, we didn't just win the war, we changed the world. He could see the subtle shift in the room. Varkel's smug expression was gone, replaced with something else. Uncertainty, perhaps. The Thraxians had never encountered an opponent that didn't see war as a contest of might. But Marcus was painting a picture of a different kind of conflict, one where survival, adaptation, and innovation were the true weapons. You think war is about crushing your enemy into submission, Marcus said, his voice taking on a hard edge. But for us, it's about something more. It's about ensuring that no matter what happens, no matter how dire the situation, we find a way to survive. We always have, and we always will. The room was completely silent now, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on every being present. The Thraxians, the other species, they were all beginning to see what Marcus had known all along. Humanity wasn't to be underestimated. Not because they were stronger, but because they were relentless. And that's the lesson you need to understand, Varkel, Marcus said quietly. War with us won't be a glorious battle. It will be a long, drawn-out conflict that will drain you, that will push you beyond your limits. Because while you're fighting for dominance, we'll be fighting for survival. And there is no force in the galaxy more dangerous than a species fighting for its right to exist. Varkel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Marcus could see the doubt creeping in, the realization that humanity might not be the easy target the Thraxians had thought. You may be the strongest species in the galaxy, Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. But we're the ones who have always learned how to win against the odds. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but Marcus knew the seed had been planted. The Thraxians were starting to understand that this wouldn't be the war they were expecting. And for the first time, they were beginning to realize that humanity's true strength wasn't something they could crush with force alone. General Marcus had captured their attention fully now, but he wasn't done. The Thraxians prided themselves on brute strength and the chaos of battle, but there was something they didn't grasp yet, something far more powerful than any weapon or army. Marcus knew that humanity's strength wasn't just in how they fought, but in how they avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Sometimes, the greatest victories came without a single shot fired. In your world, Varkel, Marcus began, his voice steady. Power is measured by how much damage you can do, by how many enemies you can crush. But in our history, we learned that true strength can lie in avoiding conflict altogether. We've fought wars, yes, but some of our most significant victories were won without ever engaging in a direct battle. The Thraxians regarded him with confusion, clearly unaccustomed to the notion of avoiding conflict. Marcus pressed on, knowing this was the part of the lesson they would struggle to understand. We faced a period in our history called the Cold War. He continued. Two superpowers, each capable of annihilating the other, stood on the brink of total destruction for decades. We had weapons that could wipe out entire cities in seconds. Both sides had enough firepower to destroy the entire planet several times over. He paused for a moment, letting that sink in. Even the Thraxians, fierce as they were, had never seen the full potential of humanity's nuclear arsenal. But we didn't fight, Marcus said, his voice quieter now. We didn't because we understood that such a war would have no winners. It wasn't about who had the strongest army or the most devastating weapons. It was about knowing that using them would mean the end for everyone. So, instead of engaging in open warfare, we waged a different kind of war. One fought with information, with diplomacy, with psychology. The Thraxians exchanged glances. This was entirely foreign to them. War not fought on a battlefield, but through subtle, calculated moves. We call it psychological warfare, Marcus explained. Instead of attacking directly, we sowed doubt, confusion, and fear. We used spies to gather intelligence, broke their codes to stay one step ahead. We manipulated the perception of power. At times, the threat of action was more powerful than action itself. Both sides stood on the edge, ready to strike, but neither dared make the first move. The silence in the chamber deepened. Varkle frowned, clearly grappling with the concept. Marcus saw it, the moment when the Thraxians began to realize that there were other forms of power, ones they had never considered. It wasn't just strength that kept us alive during that time, Marcus continued. It was restraint. The ability to think, to plan, to anticipate. We learned that the mind can be a far more dangerous weapon than any blade or gun. We fought a war that was won without a battle ever taking place. The implications of what he was saying began to settle on Varkle. In his world, conflict meant bloodshed, glory was in the taking of lives. But here was Marcus, describing a war of intellect, one that didn't require the spilling of blood to win. And that's not the only way we've won without fighting, Marcus said, his voice growing more intense. We've also mastered the art of diplomacy. While you might conquer and subjugate, we form alliances, we negotiate, we build bridges with our enemies. After the devastation of the Second World War, two of our fiercest opponents, Germany and Japan, became our closest allies. Not because we crushed them into submission, but because we helped them rebuild. We turned former enemies into partners, and in doing so, we strengthened ourselves. Varkle's expression shifted slightly. The Thraxians had never considered such an approach. To them, enemies were to be destroyed, not allied with. Yet here was Marcus, suggesting that humanity grew stronger by healing wounds, by turning their foes into friends. We've learned, Marcus said, that diplomacy can be more effective than any weapon. Where others might seek to destroy their enemies, we seek to understand them. And in understanding them, we find ways to avoid war altogether. We've prevented countless conflicts through negotiation, through careful maneuvering, through the power of words rather than the force of arms. The Thraxians were listening now, fully engaged. This was a new kind of warfare, one that didn't align with their traditions of strength and violence. But they were beginning to understand that humanity's ability to avoid conflict was just as dangerous as their ability to fight. Your way of war, Marcus said, locking eyes with Varkle, is direct, brutal, and effective in the short term. But our way ensures that we survive for the long term. We've mastered the art of patience, of outlasting our enemies, of turning potential conflicts into opportunities for growth. There was a pause, and Marcus allowed the room to breathe, to consider the weight of his words. He knew that the Thraxians had never encountered an enemy like humanity, one that could fight on a different level entirely, psychologically, diplomatically, and strategically. And make no mistake, Varkle, Marcus added, his tone sharper now. If we must fight, we will. But understand this, our greatest victories have come not through sheer force, but through our ability to adapt, to think, to strategize. While you seek to destroy your enemies, we seek to overcome them in ways that don't always involve bloodshed. Varkle's brow furrowed, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. The arrogance that had been so apparent earlier was starting to crumble. Marcus could see it, the realization that perhaps humanity was not the weak, naive species they had believed them to be. You think that war with us will be a simple matter of strength, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. But war with humanity is never simple. We fight on multiple fronts, on the battlefield, yes, but also in the mind, in diplomacy, in the shadows. You might win the first battle, but we will find ways to strike back in ways you can't anticipate. The Thraxians were clearly unsettled now. This was not the war they had envisioned. They had expected a conflict of brute force, where their strength would simply crush any opposition. But Marcus was revealing a different kind of war, one where strength alone wasn't enough. And that is why you should think carefully before engaging with us, Marcus finished. Because while you may have the advantage in physical strength, we have mastered the art of survival. We don't seek war, but if it comes, we'll fight in ways you've never seen before. Ways that will leave you questioning every move, every decision, until you realize too late that you're no longer in control. Varkle was silent now, his eyes narrowed in thought. The Thraxians had been taught to fear only physical might, but Marcus had shown them a different kind of power, a power that was less visible, but no less dangerous. A power that came from the mind, from strategy, from the ability to turn enemies into allies and to win wars without ever firing a shot. Marcus knew that the lesson was sinking in. The Thraxians had never encountered an enemy like humanity. And now, they were beginning to understand that this war, if it ever came, would be unlike any they had ever fought. General Marcus could sense the shift in the air. The Thraxians were beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, that the fight they so eagerly sought was not a straightforward contest of strength. Yet there was one final lesson they needed to learn, something even deeper than warfare or strategy. It wasn't just about how humanity fought, or even how they avoided fighting. It was about why they fought. This was the core of what made humans truly dangerous. Varkle, Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying weight. You've seen our history, and you've heard about our wars. But what you need to understand most is that our strength isn't in our weapons, or our strategy, or even our endurance. Our strength comes from something much more profound, our reason for fighting. Varkle's brow furrowed, as if struggling to grasp this. Marcus had expected this. To the Thraxians, war was a way of life, a method to assert dominance and expand their empire. But for humans, war was different. War was not something sought for glory, but something endured out of necessity. We don't fight because we want to, Marcus said, his tone growing more intense. We fight because we have to. When we go to war, it's not to prove we're the strongest or to take what isn't ours. We fight because we're protecting something. We fight for our survival, for our people, for our future. The silence in the room was thick with tension, but Marcus didn't stop. When our back is against the wall, when everything is on the line, that's when we're at our most dangerous. You see, Varkle, there's nothing more powerful than a species fighting for its very existence. We've been there before. We've seen our world nearly destroyed, we've faced extinction more than once, but each time, we fought harder than before. Not because we're the strongest, but because we know what's at stake. He let that sink in. The Thraxians might understand strength, but they didn't understand desperation. They didn't understand what it meant to have everything on the line. When you fight for dominance, you seek to expand your power, to conquer, Marcus continued. But when we fight to protect what's ours. To protect our families, our homes, our planet. And that makes us relentless. That makes us impossible to break. You can kill a soldier, but you can't kill an idea. You can destroy a city, but you can't destroy the will of a people who refuse to be conquered. Varkel's gaze was fixed on Marcus now, his expression unreadable. But Marcus could tell the message was getting through. We've faced forces that seemed unstoppable before, Marcus said. We've stood against enemies who thought they could crush us. But every time, we've found a way to endure. Not because we're stronger. Not because we're faster. But because we're driven by something you can't understand, a need to protect what we care about. A need to survive. The room remained utterly still, every eye locked on Marcus. He could feel the weight of his words pressing down on the Thoraxians, on the other species in the chamber. They were beginning to grasp the truth that Varkel hadn't considered. Humanity's strength wasn't just in their resilience, or their strategies. It was in their will to survive at all costs. And that's what makes us a dangerous enemy, Varkel, Marcus said quietly but firmly. We don't stop. We don't give up. Even when the odds are impossible, even when victory seems beyond reach, we keep fighting. Because we have no other choice. Because giving up isn't in our nature. He paused, letting the room absorb the weight of what he was saying. We will fight until the very last breath, until the very last man, woman, and child if we have to. And that's why you should think twice before starting a war with us. Because while you may be the stronger species, we are the more determined. We are the more driven. And in the end, that's what wins wars. Varkel's fists tightened slightly at his sides, but he remained silent, listening intently. Marcus knew that the Thoraxian leader was grappling with the concept. For the Thoraxians, war was a show of power, a means of control. For humans, war was something far more personal, something tied to their very survival. We've rebuilt from the ashes before, Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. We've survived wars that should have wiped us out. We've endured plagues, famine, and disasters that brought us to the brink. And every time, we've come back stronger. Not because we wanted to fight, but because we had to. That's the human spirit, Varkel. That's what drives us. And that's why, in the end, you'll lose if you choose war with us. The weight of Marcus's words hung heavily in the room. The Thoraxians, so confident, so sure of their dominance, were now faced with something they had never anticipated. An enemy that didn't measure strength in physical power, but in the will to survive. We don't want this war, Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. But if you bring it to us, we'll fight. And we'll fight harder than you can imagine. We'll fight until there's nothing left. And in the end, you'll realize that the war you thought you wanted wasn't worth the cost. The silence was deafening now, but Marcus knew the message had been delivered. This wasn't about posturing or threats. It was about understanding what lay at the heart of every conflict humanity had ever faced. The will to protect what mattered most. And that's why you should reconsider, Varkel, Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. Because when you push us, when you threaten what we hold dear, you'll find that strength alone isn't enough. You'll find that we're prepared to fight, not just for victory, but for survival. And in that fight, we are unbreakable. Varkel's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty in them. The Thoraxian leader had come seeking war, but he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected an opponent who wasn't just willing to fight, but one who would fight with everything they had, everything they were. We may not be the strongest, Marcus finished, his voice steady, but we will always be the ones who survive. And that is the lesson you needed to learn today. The silence in the chamber was heavy, and Marcus stood still, knowing that the seed had been planted. The Thoraxians now understood what they were truly up against. This wasn't a battle they could win by sheer force alone. This was a battle that would test their will, and against humanity, that was a fight they weren't prepared for.